Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the Old Testament prophecy of Hosea and chapter 10. Hosea and chapter 10. The political pundits reckon that the biggest challenge facing our government post-pandemic is the rising cost of living. It is, of course, prior to the publication of the Sue Gray report that they are saying that, but whatever happens as a result of that report, the rising cost of living will need their attention sooner or later because an increasing number of households are feeling a squeeze on their budgets, so much so that 2022 is being called the year of the squeeze. But have you ever noticed that although we hear a lot in the news about people's finances in difficult times, we don't tend to hear so much about them in good times? Have you noticed that? And that is not only true in the case of the national press, it is also true in the case of the Christian press. In his little book on Hosea, Tim Chester points out that there are many books that have been written with the aim of helping Christians with adversity, but far fewer that aim to help Christians with prosperity. And yet, says Chester, from the Bible's perspective, prosperity is as much a threat to faith as adversity. And that is certainly what the history of the 8th century BC Northern Kingdom of Israel demonstrates. Within this 10th chapter, we see that they were a people of whom certain things were true. We're going to look at three. Firstly, verses 1 and 2, they are a people who bear no fruit. They are a people who bear no fruit. Now, at the time Hosea was writing, the northern kingdom of Israel was known a time of great prosperity. And that is why we read in verse 1 that Israel was a spreading vine, or as the ESV says, Israel was a luxuriant vine. And so, in one sense, they were being fruitful. But if you look at the second line of verse 2, you will see that in their fruitfulness, Israel was bringing forth fruit for itself. Did you notice that? And that little comment ought to raise some concerns. It ought to flag up a warning sign because, as you may well know from other parts of Scripture, Old Testament Israel was a vine which was meant to produce fruit for God. For example, in the 5th chapter of his prophecy, Isaiah sings a song, a beautiful song to begin with. It doesn't turn out so nice as he works his way through it, but he sings a song in which the southern kingdom of Judah is portrayed as God's vineyard. And having described how God prepared the soil and God planted it with the choicest of vines, we read of God doing in verse 2 of that chapter what the owner of any vineyard would do, and that is, then he looked for a crop of good grapes. The purpose for which God brought Old Testament Israel into existence, the purpose for which he planted her as a vine, was that she might produce good fruit. But sadly, what Isaiah discovered about the southern kingdom of Judah was, Isaiah 5 verse 2, God looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. And what was true of the southern kingdom in Isaiah's day is also now true of the northern kingdom of Israel in Hosea's day. Israel was a spreading vine. He brought forth fruit, not for God, sadly, but for himself. And what did that fruit look like in the case of the northern kingdom? As his fruit increased, he built more altars. As his land prospered, he adorned his sacred stones. Did you hear that? As his fruit increased, he built more altars. Now, on a first reading, you might think that that sounds very commendable. On the surface, it sounds as if the more Israel prospered, the more they built altars to thank God for their prosperity. But that is not what was happening. Because as we've seen throughout the book, and especially back in chapter 8, verse 11, the altars they were building were altars to false pagan gods. And that is why verse 1 goes on to say, as his land prospered, he adorned his sacred stones. Those stones being the sacred stones of the pagan shrines. And so here we have a people who were planted as a vineyard in order to bear fruit that would bring glory to God, when in actual fact the fruit they are bearing is bringing glory to other gods, false gods. And so whereas we heard the Lord saying in chapter 9 verse 10, when I found Israel, it was like finding grapes in the desert. God's assessment of these people now is very different. By the start of chapter 2, by the start of this chapter, verse 2, we hear God saying, their heart is deceitful, and now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will demolish their altars and destroy their sacred stones. The very thing that they have invested their prosperity in is going to be demolished and destroyed. Not because the property market has taken a sudden, unexpected shift. They're going to be destroyed not because tectonic plates have taken an unexpected shift. They're going to be destroyed because God is going to step in judgment. That is what happened to these people who professed to be the people of God, but who bore no fruit for God. And did you know that is still what happens to people? Even to those who profess to be the people of God, but who bear no fruit for God. As you read through the Bible, you discover that Old Testament prophets such as Isaiah and Hosea were not the last people to use the vine as an illustration. As we will discover in our new series of Bible studies in John's Gospel, that was an illustration that Jesus also used. Whereas Old Testament Israel had failed as a vine, Jesus describes himself in John 15 as the true vine. I am the true vine, said Jesus, and my Father is the gardener. But then he immediately goes on to say this. He, that is the Father, the gardener, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. The fact that such people are described as branches of this vine indicates that Jesus is referring to people who have some kind of connection with Jesus, some kind of association with Jesus. He's referring to people like Judas. He's referring to people that are described in Hebrews chapter 3, 2 John verse 9, or those people that we came across in 1 John chapter 2, you may remember, people who had appeared to be part and parcel of the Christian community, but whose subsequent belief and behaviour demonstrated that they never did belong to Jesus Christ. Yes, just as in Hosea's day, so there continues to be people who profess to belong to the people of God, people who profess to be Christians, people who appear to be part and parcel of the Christian church, but whose lives bear none of the fruit that God is looking for in the branches of his vine. Their lives show no evidence of those characteristics which are the marks, the telltale signs of true saving faith in Jesus Christ. Their lives show no evidence of that fruit of the indwelling Spirit of God as described in Galatians chapter 5. Like the people of Hosea's day, their lives are ultimately lived entirely for their own pleasure, or for their own glory, or for the glory of some man-made god that they have chosen to embrace and worship. And just as a distinct absence of fruit, of good fruit, in the life of his professing people in Old Testament times led to divine judgment, so the absence of such fruit today, even in the lives of those who profess to be the people of God, the absence of such good fruit today likewise leads to divine judgment. That is the judgment that Jesus is referring to in John 15, when he says that God cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. That is the judgment that Jesus is referring to a few verses later on in that chapter, when he says, if anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. That's what happens to a people who bear no fruit. Secondly, in Hosea chapter 10, we see a people whose institutions will fail them. Verses 3 to 8, a people whose institutions will fail them. Now, by the time we get to verse 3, Hosea is looking forward to that time of judgment that has just been referred to in verse 2, and that will be a time when Israel will have no king. As the closing verse of the chapter says, when that day comes, when that day dawns, the king of Israel will be completely destroyed. On that day, Israel will have no king. And even if they did have a king, second half of verse 3, what good would he be to them? On that day, what good would he be? They will be in that situation because, first half of verse 3, they have not revered the Lord, or as the ESV says, they have not feared the Lord. And having rejected God's ultimate authority over them, all other authority has become relative. Having rejected God's ultimate authority over them, morality has become relative. And consequently, their society is already marked by a distinct lack of integrity. As verse 4 says, they make many promises, they take false oaths, and they make agreements. Therefore, lawsuits spring up like poisonous weeds in a ploughed field. With no ultimate authority, and therefore no objective morality, no one's words could ultimately be trusted anymore. Oh, people made plenty of promises, and they even took oaths, but a lot of the time it was empty, meaningless words, and consequently the legal system was busier than ever. Just as a ploughed field, and you'll know this if you've ever dug a garden, you've put in an enormous amount of time and effort to dig it, and it's looking beautiful. But if you do nothing else with it, if you just sit there and watch it, then over a period of time, you'll see weeds springing up here, there, and everywhere. So likewise, there were lawsuits springing up here, there, and everywhere within Israel. Having refused to fear the Lord, they are discovering that their long-standing institutions are failing them and will continue to fail them. Their words can no longer be trusted, and even their king will be of no use to them. And as we look back over history, you can see that trend happening time and time again in history. Societies which stop fearing God and stop recognizing the ultimate authority of God, such societies usually end up being societies which despise and dismiss authority of every description, and that dismissal of authority inevitably leads to a lack of morality, a lack of integrity, and therefore a lack of trust amongst its citizens. When it was founded 220 years ago, the London Stock Exchange adopted a motto which said, "Dictum meum pactum." Does anybody know what that means in English?
My word is my bond.
Very good, Michael, very good. Translated, it means my word is my bond. That is the motto that the London Stock Exchange was founded upon. At that time, financial transactions were made entirely verbally and were trusted. Now, in the world of finance, there are probably more lawyers than financiers, because a person's word can no longer be taken at face value. Every area of society now feels the need to employ lawyers to ensure that what is said is actually what is meant and what is ultimately done. That's the lack of trust. That's the lack of integrity that results when a society no longer fears the Lord. Our long-standing and even some of our longest-standing institutions begin to fail us. But then what we have to remember is that the northern kingdom of Israel was not only a political entity, it was not only a financial entity, it was also a religious entity. And what we have from verse 5 onwards is a description of how even Israel's religious institution will fail her on that coming day of judgment. Verse 5, the people who live in Samaria fear for the calf idol of Bethaven. Being the capital city, Samaria is shorthand for the entire kingdom. And whereas Jeroboam had originally set up 2 calf idols, you may remember from 1 Kings 12, he set up one at the southern extremity of his kingdom at Bethel, and he set up one at the northern end in Dan. That northern one of Dan has already been annexed by enemy forces, leaving just the southern one at Bethel. But rather than call it Bethel, which means the house of God, Hosea calls it Bethaven, which means the house of wickedness. They say, what's in a name? Well, in this case, there's a lot in a name. What a contrast from Bethel to Bethaven. What a contrast from being the house of God to being the house of wickedness. That is precisely what it had become with its pagan idolatrous worship. And yet, in spite of it being a den of idolatry and iniquity, that place and its idol now occupies a special place in the hearts and the minds of those people, so much so that with the threat of Assyria looming on the horizon, they now fear. They now fear for the future of their calf idol at Bethaven. And so they should, because there will come a day when, verse 5, its people will mourn over it, and so will its idolatrous priests, those who had rejoiced over its splendour, because it's taken from them into exile. It is carried off to Assyria. Verse 6 is tribute for the great king of Assyria. Ephraim will be disgraced. Israel will be ashamed of its wooden idols. Hosea is now looking forward to that time when the judgment spoken of in verse 2 is finally executed and the Assyrian army invades. And on that day, neither king nor idol will be of any use to them whatsoever. The idol will be carted off to Assyria, verse 6, and their king will float away like a twig on the surface of the waters. Do you remember as children? I suppose it depends whether you had a decent river running through your town, but you remember as children we used to drop little sticks over one side of the bridge, and then we used to run over to the other side of the bridge and look over the other side, and we could see that little twig being swept away with the current. Such twigs were powerless to resist the flow of the river, and so it will be for Samaria and its king on that day, even its king. He too will be powerless to resist what is happening, and as for her false gods, once they are carted off to Assyria, the high places of wickedness will be destroyed. Verse 8, thorns and thistles will cover their altars. You're out walking in the countryside, and you come across some old ruins. They're ruins perhaps of an old building or an old garden, but it's barely visible under the weeds and the brambles and the briars. Have you ever had that sort of experience? Whatever it was that was once there, you can tell that it's had better days. Its influence and its usefulness are well and truly a thing of the past, now just covered, barely visible under the brambles and the briars. And so it will be for Israel's pagan worship sites on that day. They too will very quickly become relics of the past with no ongoing influence whatsoever. And so do you see what will happen to Israel on that coming day? It's a couple of decades down the line when Assyria crosses its borders and invades. On that day, Israel will be a people whose institutions, whose cherished institutions, whose longest standing institutions, whose institutions were at the very heart of them as a nation, their institutions, both political and religious, will fail her. That's what happens when people put their confidence in this world's institutions, and we've seen plenty of examples of that throughout history. People who put their confidence in this world's financial institutions are sometimes left bankrupt if there's a banking crisis. People who put their confidence in this world's political institutions are often left disillusioned by the inconsistency of their political leaders. And people who put their confidence in this world's religious institutions, they're left disillusioned by their corruption and their hypocrisy. We've seen examples of that throughout history. And some of us may have been unfortunate enough to experience it, discovered that our most treasured institutions in life have failed us. But even if we haven't yet found them to fail, this passage is warning us that come the judgment of God, all such man-made institutions will fail us. Just as Israel's king and idols would be of no use to her whatsoever come their day of divine judgment, so our political and financial and religious institutions will be of no use to us whatsoever come our day of judgment. And that's why we need to make sure that our confidence is not in them. Otherwise, we too will become a people whose institutions fail us. We've seen a people who bore no fruit. We've seen a people whose institutions failed them. Thirdly and finally, from the end of verse 8 through to verse 15, we see a people whose history will repeat itself. A people whose history will repeat itself. Now, if you were with us a few weeks ago, then when we studied chapter 9, you may remember that there was a reference back there in chapter 9, verse 9 of that chapter, there was a reference to Gibeah. The story of Gibeah, it's a town which belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. It's a story that's described in Judges 19 and 20. And as I read in a little book this week, that of all the stories that are in children's bedtimes Bible stories, the story of Gibeah is never included there. And if you read Judges 19 and 20, you'll know why. It's one of the darkest chapters in Old Testament history. And as a result of the wickedness that occurred on that occasion in that town, the other tribes of Israel waged war against the tribe of Benjamin, resulting in the death of 25,000 Benjamite men. I think there were only 600 Benjamite men left out of the whole tribe. The 12 tribes of Israel very nearly became the 11 tribes that day. And consequently, that occasion would have been etched on Israel's memory. But what Hosea is warning the northern kingdom of here, many years later, is that their history is in danger of repeating itself. It's in danger of repeating itself, not because history automatically goes round in endless circles, as some people would have us believe, but it's in danger of repeating itself because you're not any better than they were back in Gibeah. Since the days of Gibeah, verse 9, you have sinned, O Israel, and there you have remained. Did not war overtake the evildoers of Gibeah? Yes, it did. And if they suffered God's judgment as a result of their sin, then what's to make you think, says Hosea, what's to make you think that you too won't suffer God's judgment for your wickedness and your sin? And so just as God brought the other tribes of Israel against the tribe of Benjamin back then as an expression of his judgment, so he will bring other nations, verse 10, against the northern kingdom in judgment. Because of their persistent and because of their repeated sin, their history is in danger of repeating itself. Oh, the sad thing is that there was a time when Israel was like a trained calf, delighting in fulfilling her God-given role, verse 11. Back then, and using the ESV, back then, God spared her fair neck in the sense that he did not put a heavy yoke on it. He didn't need to, because back then she obeyed willingly. But sadly, those days are gone. And now she is a rebellious and disobedient people, and consequently God is now going to put a heavy yoke on her neck. A yoke of judgment on her. A yoke that will result in her serving her Assyrian oppressors. That's one picture from the world of farming. Another picture. The farming picture continues in verse 12, but now Israel is the farmer. And Israel has been reminded in verse 12 one more time of what she has already repeated, what she's heard repeatedly throughout her history. And what is that? Every prophet has told her the same thing. Sow for yourself righteousness, reap the fruit of unfailing love, and break up your unploughed ground, for it is time to seek the Lord. Israel has been exhorted one more time to repent and to return to the God who has entered into covenant with her. If she does so, she will know his unfailing, steadfast love. That has been the terms of the covenant that she's heard repeatedly throughout her history. But sadly, verse 13, she's rejected it. Rather than sowing righteousness, she's planted wickedness, and as a result, she will reap evil. Rather than live in faith and dependence upon the Lord, second half of verse 13, she has depended on her own strength and consequently she will suffer the consequences. Verse 14, her fortresses will be devastated, as Shalman devastated Beth Arbel on the day of battle. Does anybody know where in Old Testament history that reference comes from? No. That's because Old Testament history does not record that occasion at Beth Arbel. But Hosea's readers clearly knew about it. And from what we're told in verses 14 and 15, it sounds as if it was a horrific occasion. Horrific. And the reason it's been referred to here is to warn these people that if they do not repent and do not return to the Lord, as exhorted to do in verse 12, then there is the very real danger of history repeating itself. Of what happened at Beth Arbel repeating itself when God once again steps in, once more, in horrific judgment. It was Woody Allen, the American TV personality, who said that the reason why history repeats itself is because we never learn the lessons first time round. Did you hear that? The reason history repeats itself is because we never learn the lessons first time round. And that was certainly true of Old Testament Israel, as the second half of this chapter has demonstrated. Repeated rebellion on the part of Israel has resulted in repeated expressions of judgment on the part of God. Rather than heed the warnings of Hosea, they persisted in rebellion, and they suffered the frightening consequences of doing so in 722 BC when the Assyrians eventually invaded. They never learnt the lessons of history, and consequently history repeated itself. Don't you think that's sad? That all the warning signs were there. All the lessons were there to be learnt. But they never learnt the lessons of history. It is sad. But what is even sadder is that it has continued to be true long after this northern kingdom ceased to exist. It continued to be true. I say that because at the very centre of this chapter, at the end of verse 8, there is a little quotation. You may have noticed as we read it, it may have rang a bell somewhere in your memory, it may have sounded a little bit familiar because it occurs at least another couple of times in Scripture. Having warned Israel, in verses 3 to 8, having warned Israel how her cherished institutions will fail her come the judgment of God, her helplessness on that day is described at the close of verse 8 in these words, horrific words. Then they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. That's how bad their experience of God's judgment is going to be. So bad, that they would rather have the mountains cave in on top of them. So bad that you would think that subsequent generations would sit up and take note and learn from their experience, would you not? Apparently not. Because 700 or so years later, as Jesus was warning Jerusalem of the judgment that she would soon experience at the hands, not of the Assyrians this time, but at the hands of the Romans, he quotes this very verse. Speaking in Luke 23, verse 28, Jesus turns to women, some women who were following him and who were weeping and wailing. They were weeping and wailing out of the sentence that had just been passed on Jesus. They were weeping and wailing for him and for his rapidly approaching crucifixion. And what did Jesus say to them? He said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me." Isn't that strange? He's on his way to the cross. It's imminent. He's been condemned. He's on the way to the cross. You would have thought a little sympathy was exactly what he needed and what he's looking for. No, says Jesus to these women, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, "Blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed." Then, quoting from Hosea 10 verse 8, they will say to the mountains, "Fall on us," and to the hills, "Cover us." Sounds like they are a people whose history, believe it or not, whose history would repeat itself yet again. And it did do in AD 70 as the Romans invaded Jerusalem and devastated the place. A people whose history repeats itself. But then what we must not forget is that such expressions of God's judgment throughout history, they're given to us as little glimpses of what God's judgment will be like on a future day when his righteous judgment is expressed fully and finally. And the reason they are recorded is so that you and I might take note, might sit up, take note, so that history might not repeat itself yet again in your experience and in mine. That's why they're recorded. So that we might sit up and take note, learn the lessons from their history, so that it might not be repeated once more in your experience and mine. Because yes, there is the danger of it doing so, as Revelation chapter 6 makes clear. Writing of that future and final expression of God's judgment, John says this, chapter 6, verse 15 of Revelation. He says, "Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, 'Fall on us.'" Do those words sound a little bit familiar to you? That's what you have in Hosea 10 verse 8. That's what Jesus has just been speaking about in Luke's Gospel. "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" Sounds like history repeating itself, but only on a much bigger and a much more frightening scale. And if you and I don't want to be amongst that people for whom history will repeat itself on that future day, then we need to learn the lessons of Hosea chapter 10. Rather than trust in our most cherished institutions, whether they be financial, whether they be political, whether they be religious in nature, rather than trust in them, and rather than trust in ourselves as these people did back then, let us make sure that the one we are trusting in is that Lamb who in his wrath is coming back on that future day of judgment. Rather than trusting in our institutions, rather than trusting in ourselves, let us make sure that we are trusting in him and in his sin-atoning death upon the cross. Let us make sure that we are trusting in that Jesus who is coming back one day to judge this world. Because as he himself said in John 15, it is only by remaining in him, it is only by being united to him through faith, that we will bear that fruit that God is looking for in our lives. It's only by remaining in him that we can bear such fruit. If we ignore him, or if we reject him, or if we refuse to trust in him, then we will find to our eternal cost that, like the people of Hosea chapter 10, we will discover on that future day that we are amongst a people, firstly, who bore no fruit. What a tragedy that would be. To be connected, associated with the vine in such way, and to some extent, to the extent that we're in a church on a Sunday singing about him, only to discover on that day that we are cut off from him because we bore no fruit. What a tragedy that would be. And what a tragedy it would be if we discovered on that day that we were amongst the people who we had put our confidence in our institutions, only to discover on that day that they have failed us. And what a tragedy it would be to discover on that day that we are amongst a people for whom history has repeated itself in judgment. It's repeated itself because we never learnt the lessons of history. Let us make sure that we are not amongst that people on that day. Let us make sure that we are amongst those who are trusting in the Lamb, believing in the Lamb, and trusting in his sacrifice in our place.